Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you're invited to speak at a college called what I would call Augsburg College, what language do you expect to speak in? Of course, I naturally prepared my lecture in German, and now I shall have to translate it into English as I go. I'll do my best. Well, I must congratulate you on having got here. I don't know by what method you managed to do so. Up at Luther Seminary, somebody remarked to me, you wouldn't meet with weather like this in India. Well, that's exactly where I have met with weather like this. I spend my life trying to persuade people that India is a cold country. Having learnt in their school geography books that it's a hot country, they regard this as my British humour and take no steps accordingly. The World Council of Churches held its first meeting in India in Lucknow in 1952 in December. I knew what would happen. In Lucknow in December, which is far inland and has something like your own climate, by day there will be brilliant sunshine, temperature up to about 80 probably. The moment the sun sets, the temperature plummets like that, goes down to perhaps 40. By the time the committee had 22 members in bed with colds, coughs and influenza, they thought perhaps I knew what I was talking about after all. But where I met the snow was in Kashmir, which is, I think, the most beautiful country in the world, far up in the northwest. The companion and I were planning a big trek through the mountains, going up to 12,000 feet. The weather was awful. However, at last, on Sunday afternoon, I said, we're going on. I chose the exactly right moment. As we went up the valley, the bad weather retreated before us, the good weather came up from behind, and we had 3 glorious days walking over the snow, up to 12,000 feet, camping in the wooden huts which the government has built for the benefit of travellers. We heard afterwards that there was a Swiss camping in the same valley at 8,000 feet. When he heard we'd gone on, he said, oh well, if there's a snowstorm, it won't matter, they won't know anything about it. It was a cheerful epitaph. Fortunately, it didn't. The only trouble was that the snow was rather soft. The Kashmiri coolies who were carrying our effects, being light, walked over the top of the snow. My companion and I, being a stone heavier, went through at every step up to our knees. And if there's any more exhausting form of walking in the world, I don't know it. Well, I'm very grateful to the President and others for having invited me to speak to you. I always enjoy talking to students, but I made very careful inquiries as to how long I should be allowed to speak. On one occasion, I had the honour of preaching at West Point Military Academy. We have 2 services. I was told at the first that I must not exceed my time. If I went over even by a minute, the cadets attending that service would be late for their parade, and the fact of attending a religious service would not be accepted as any excuse for being late. I assure you that on that occasion I was well within my time. A little later, I shall be speaking at Amherst College in Massachusetts. There they don't have a convocation like this. They have 4 short meetings every week. 2 are religious, 2 are secular. Each lasts just 15 minutes. Announcements are made, and the speaker has just 7 minutes. Woe betide him if he goes over his time. And there, being a rather tough college, they give you just 1 sentence. If they think your first sentence is interesting, they will listen. If they don't, they will start looking up their notes for the next lecture. It's quite a challenge. But here I understand there are no such rigid limitations. I'm told that your last speaker went on for 2 hours. Having just read his book, I can imagine that he had plenty to say, and I can imagine that you listened spellbound to everything he had to tell you. I don't think I shall go on for quite as long as that, but I am relieved not to be so rigidly restricted in the matter of time. Now, the title that I have suggested, Not by Bread Alone, probably gives you some indication of the kind of thing I want to talk about. This is Lent. We are thinking about the temptation of Jesus Christ, and that will serve as our starting point, though we shall wander quite a long way away from it. You know the 3 temptations. Obviously, the story comes from Jesus Christ himself. It's very highly poetical in form. I don't suppose any of you take it precisely literally. We don't think of the devil with horns and a tail coming and sitting down by Jesus Christ in the wilderness and speaking with a human voice. Of course, it's often been represented in art in that way. We, I think, would understand the devil as the more familiar one, whom we know so well, who encounters us when we are alone, speaks not with an audible human voice, but sometimes with an extremely human voice, which we can hear quite well in our interior being. And what are these temptations all about? The first one, to turn stones into bread. I think this is often misinterpreted. If thou be the Son of God, make these stones bread. Some people have suggested that the devil is trying to sow doubt in the mind of Jesus Christ as to whether he really is the chosen one, whether he is the Messiah, if thou be the Son of God. The Greek doesn't bear that out. What the Greek in point of fact means is, well now, taking it for granted that you're Son of God. That's something we accept. Then what you do with it, go on and make these stones bread. Others have gone on to suggest that this is simply a reference to the hunger of Jesus Christ in the wilderness after 40 days of fasting. That seems to me extremely trivial and superficial. Of course, that suggests the temptation, but really at the heart of it is something very much bigger and very much more important. Here you are, with tremendous gifts, with the knowledge of tremendous gifts, with a great vocation. What do you do with it, and how do you employ it? Well, there are three temptations, and each one is related to the way in which a man of these superlative human gifts can use those gifts for the performance of a particular purpose. How should we set about bringing in the kingdom of God? Temptation number one, make it a welfare state, stones into bread. Temptation number two, carry out a hair-brained, ill-calculated attack on the Roman power, expecting God to give victory, whatever risks are taken and whatever adventures are run. Third temptation, use force to bring about good effects. The temptation that always befalls the church when it is in power to attempt to use coercion as a substitute for conversion. 2 and 3 I'm going to disregard entirely today and concentrate on the first, this concept of the welfare state. The Roman idea, panem et circenses, give the poor people bread and circuses without much work to do. You'll keep them happy in a proper situation of subordination. This temptation Jesus rejects. He is not going to be concerned with supplying people with the good things of life. On one occasion, he did something rather like this. The story of the feeding of the 5,000 in the wilderness. Wilderness is a very important word in the Bible. It stands for total dependence on God. He's trying to show these people by this sign of the bread and the fish in the wilderness that they must learn to be totally dependent upon God, receive what he gives, and that God will care for them. But of course his sign is misunderstood, as he complains bitterly to some of those who were there. They didn't understand the sign. They didn't understand what he was saying about God. They just wanted to eat the loaves and fishes, have an easy time, be provided for forevermore, kept warm and peaceful and comfortable and happy. That was their ideal of what the kingdom of God was going to be like. Jesus rejected the temptation, and on the whole, the church has rejected it too. The church on the whole has taught people not to be unduly concerned about the good things of this life, to turn their backs on the world, not to seek for prosperity and comfort, but to seek salvation in hardship, in accepting the will of God, with all too often the promise of compensation in the sky. This has been rightly and very properly criticized by some of the enemies of the church. There is a balance on the whole throughout history. The church has come down on that side. I take a great figure like St. Bernard in the 11th century. A great man, a great teacher, a great writer. Bernard was absolutely certain that you couldn't be saved in the world. The only way you could possibly be saved was to enter the monastery, live a life of extreme asceticism, denying yourself the good things of the world, and then you would have hope for the future. The world is so wicked and so corrupt, indulgence in its pleasures takes the soul so far away from God, there is no hope for you. And so gradually he got pretty well his whole family into the monastery, eventually his parents, a brother and a sister, and of course, if he had been completely successful, presumably the human race would have died out altogether in a comparatively short time, and that could hardly be supposed to be the purpose of God. Now I say the emphasis has come down on this side, and then comes the reaction. The reaction comes notably and conspicuously in the person of Karl Marx. Now one has to be rather careful in the United States saying anything nice about Karl Marx or the communists, but we will suppose that the FBI are not here, and I shall speak somewhat venturously what is in my mind. You see, what Jesus said was, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. The church has tended to emphasize the second, the word of God, so much as sometimes to forget the first. And Karl Marx came along and said, man shall live by bread. Now that is a very great and very important truth, which the church ought never to have forgotten. Now Jesus says, man shall not live by bread alone. But that is only meaningful if you understand the great principle that man shall live by bread. Man's physical condition, the provision for his needs, is a vitally important part of Christian faith, of politics, of administration, of the organization of human society. Now, there's a good deal of mythology about this. People say the working class in Europe was bitterly oppressed, as it was, underfed, overworked, overdriven, and the churches were deaf to the cry of these oppressed people. Karl Marx heard them, and in his compassion he produced his new gospel of materialism, prosperity for all, the redistribution of property, the communist, the socialist state. I say there's a good deal of mythology about that. Karl Marx was not at all a compassionate man. He wasn't really interested in people's sufferings, except as a means for promoting the strife of classes and the dictatorship of the proletariat. He was a cold, scientific analyst of society. He objected to the capitalists, not because they oppressed the poor, he took it for granted they would do that, but because they were an anachronism. They didn't realize that the arrow of progress had already pointed beyond them to the world of the proletariat. They were holding up the revolution, and that's what made Marx so indignant. Feudalism had passed away. Capitalism was an improvement on it, a better exploitation of the resources of the world. Now capitalism is already doomed. We move forward into the world of the proletariat, and those who hold up that progress will meet with Karl Marx's ire. So on that side, the sentimental presentation of Karl Marx as the compassionate man is, I think, unhistorical. And on the other side, the churches had heard the voice of the poor very much more than Karl Marx knew, or than has been recognized in the mythology of a century. At last, historical research is catching up with this. Very interesting work is being done, and has now been established in a very interesting book called The 10 Hours Parson, about a clergyman who was a great fighter for the rights of the working class in Yorkshire in northern England. He was fighting for the 10 Hours Bill. Now, it's almost incredible that this revolutionary bill said no more than that women and children must not work more than a 60 hours week. That was regarded as highly revolutionary and dangerous, and was opposed by almost all conservatives who believed that everything was for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Now, the great philanthropist, Lord Shaftesbury, that time Lord Ashley, heir to the peerage and therefore in the House of Commons, took up the cause of the working men in the name of Jesus Christ, rallied support, and in this very interesting little piece of research on Yorkshire at that time, it comes out that 80% of the Anglican clergy in that area were behind the 10 Hours Parson, George Bull, in his efforts to support Lord Shaftesbury, get this bill onto the statute book so that it would become law and women and children would receive that minimal measure of protection. Remember, this is only 130 years ago. It is startling to recognize that women and children in so-called Christian England at that time needed that measure of protection, and the church was behind them. But this emphasis, man shall live by bread, has been revolutionary in our thinking. We look at life in a quite different way, and even those of us who are most opposed to communism in every form have learnt a great deal more from Karl Marx, probably, than we know. If you look at the history textbooks used in a college like this 100 years ago and compare them with your own, you'll see the gap. 100 years ago, what was history about? Kings and wars and battles and things of that kind, and the simple everyday facts of what men eat and what they wear and how things are produced. This is hardly mentioned in any history of a century ago. The science of economic history, which is so very important in all our history faculties, was invented in Cambridge about 80 years ago, and now, of course, it is almost the central factor. Compare the old Cambridge modern history that began to come out at the beginning of this century, the new Cambridge modern history that is now appearing, and again you see the gap. We see that all important are these simple, elementary facts that men must eat. What do they eat and where does it come from? Men must have clothes. How are they made and who makes them? Men must move from place to place. What are the means of communication? We are concentrating more and more on this aspect of history, and when we do so, the same thing is true in politics, when we do so, we are unconsciously paying tribute to Karl Marx, who produced this revolution in human thinking, this more balanced understanding of the place of physical, of sheer human need in the organization of human affairs. Now, in our own country, Britain, my own country, I, in my lifetime, have lived through a revolution. We are a very conservative people, and even our revolutions we carry out so quietly that hardly anybody realizes that there has been a revolution. When King James II became a Roman Catholic and was driven out, we invited the Dutch Calvinist to come over and become King of Great Britain and Ireland, and therefore, of course, constitutional head of the Anglican Church of England. When William and Mary and his successor Queen Anne died without children, we invited over the good Lutheran, or perhaps not very good Lutheran, the Elector of Hanover, again to become King of Britain and once again constitutional head of the Church of England. And all these things happened so quietly that apart from one abortive rebellion in Scotland, the whole thing went through perfectly peacefully and the new epoch came. Well, in the same way, in this century, we have lived through a tremendous revolution in my country. When I look back to my own boyhood and the condition of the working class at that time, I am immensely thankful for what has taken place. 50 years ago, no, a little more than that now, you've got to go back 55, 56 years ago, in Britain, no old age pensions, no unemployment insurance, no accident insurance, none of these measures that we take absolutely for granted today as normal in any Christian country. That meant that if a man got out of work, there was nothing for him to do except gradually to sell off or pawn his poor furniture and possessions to buy food for his children. His wife would probably go out to work doing charing in the house of some more wealthy people, earn a few shillings. The children go out to work at 14. The situation was lamentable. Now, with this tremendous redistribution of property, we have a completely different society. An American visitor visiting Britain some time ago said, "They've got poverty licked." I think he was too kind, because our general standard of living is lower than yours, but the inequality is far less. And when I look at the children of the working class today, tall, upstanding, well-built, obviously well-fed, well-clothed, and compare that with what I used to see 50 years ago, I am profoundly thankful. Of course, it's meant sacrifice for certain people. My father was a minister, and not a particularly rich one. It may surprise you to know that in my home when I was a boy, there were 6 of us, we never had less than 3 servants living in the house. That was the old style. And when I go on from here to New York, I shall be staying in one of the few houses still standing in New York built on that plan. They must have had at least 5 servants living in at the beginning of this century. The whole of the top story of the 5-story house was dedicated to their accommodation, and in the basement underground they did their work. Not many of those are still standing in America. That was the kind of attitude when I was a boy. Of course, that's completely gone, and a very good thing too. Now, don't let me exaggerate. Don't imagine we have no problems. We have. Housing is a big one. A great many of the houses in Britain are built just at the wrong time, about 80 years ago, and when you've got houses built, it's quite a business to remove them and put something else in their place. We are just beginning, as you know, to have a colour problem, with the coming in of very large numbers of West Indians and also Pakistanis, who bring a different tradition of living and not easily assimilable. We've got quite a problem on our hands there. Certainly we've got to go further in the direction of equality of opportunity in education. That has broadened out very widely. It's got to go further. They're living in Germany. I noticed that in East Germany, 25% of the students come from so-called working-class families. In Western Germany, where I live in Hamburg, only 5% from working-class families. This is the kind of fact we've got to take account of. Now, Britain would be rather on the level of Western Germany, and here we've got a great deal more to do. But I asked myself, why in the world is there a problem of prosperity in this country? What has gone wrong in the strongest and richest country in the whole world? Why does the President have to declare war on poverty here? That's not for me to answer, that's your problem. But now, apart from our own Western countries, we are realizing this gigantic problem of the fact that 1/3 of the world is comparatively well off and 1/3 of the world is poor. We are faced with this gigantic problem of the underdeveloped countries, of which, of course, India is one. How are we going to get this major redistribution of the good things that God has put into the world so that every man and woman in the world will have enough to eat, every child will have reasonable opportunity for education and progress? When you think of the numbers involved, that really is a headache. Now, it's very important not to exaggerate. People tend to talk too readily about the misery of India. The Indians are not a miserable people. They're a remarkably courageous one and show quite astonishing cheerfulness in the face of circumstances that might well depress us. Don't imagine that everybody in India is half-starved and miserable all the time. That's an absolutely false picture. What is true, I would say, is that about 20% of the population has quite definitely too little to eat for 2 months every year. It may be a little more, it may be 25-30%, it could be 3 months in a year. Of course, that's a very unsatisfactory situation. Don't let's exaggerate, but do let us look it in the face and say, now, what in the world is this Western world going to do to put this sort of thing right? Now, it's a very much more difficult problem than is often supposed. There's a vast amount of superfluous wheat in the United States. Why don't we pack it all off to India and at least give people 1 square meal? Now, in famine conditions, that is certainly the right thing to do, just to keep people alive. Famine is recurrent in India, though nothing like what it was a century ago. Just to give the necessary food is a generous and blessed action, but it doesn't solve any problems. In the first place, it upsets the Indian market. The market is a delicate thing. If you suddenly inject large quantities of grain into a somewhat unstable market, you throw the whole thing into chaos, and that is no good thing to do. And it doesn't help at the essential level, which is helping people to help themselves. That's what we're learning more and more. Your Peace Corps is based on this idea, but of course that's an amateurish and quite small enterprise, which I have the highest regard and respect. I've met some of the Peace Corps boys and girls out in West Africa last year. That's just scratching the surface. It means people have got to go in and live alongside the people and understand their ways and see how they can be helped to help themselves, how they can be got from this low level of human existence to something better, but it can only come by their efforts. We can only pump prime. We can only show the way perhaps give encouragement, a little inspiration, but they have got to take hold and make their own world. Otherwise it comes to be simply Western patronage, Western condescension, and that is rightly resented in these other countries. Now, I'm not going to talk about the problems of the United States. You know them better than I, but naturally, like you, I've been pondering very deeply since I arrived here the tragic events of the last few days and weeks. And my concern is this: are people thinking out the long-term policy by which the Negro can be helped to help himself? I think you may take it for granted that by the end of this year the Negro will have the vote. It may take a little longer, and then that's the big question. You have the vote, what do you do with it, and how does it help you? I wonder whether people in the North are taking seriously the long-term proposition in the South and reckoning that it may be a vocation for many thousands of white Northerners to go down and live in the South, not for a tip-and-run raid, not for a march or a procession, not for a sit-in strike, but for 40 years. You Lutherans have a great church in New Guinea. I hope you know about it. I hope you know about that great triumph of the gospel. How did it come about? Because missionaries went and lived there with the people under the most difficult conditions and stayed there for 40 years. Not long ago I had the privilege of a conversation with Christian Kaiser. Do you know about Christian Kaiser? If you don't, find out. He was then, I think, 82 years old and died the following year, a man who in an almost unique way had got inside the mind of the New Guinea people. These very, very simple, primitive people understood it from within, and with that understanding had planted the seed of the gospel and watched it grow among those people. Now, when people do it in New Guinea, well, there's something heroic and romantic about that, and we read about it and a bit romanticize it. But I don't believe anything much is going to happen in the South short of a 40-year plan of regeneration, readaptation, education, uplift, help on every level of intellectual, economic, social life for our Negro friends. I believe it may be the case that a great many of your generation will be called to go for a lifetime of service, a lifetime of hard, largely unremunerative service in those backward areas if the Negro is to become really integrated, as more than just a token outward integration in such things as the opening of places of entertainment, the giving of the vote, and so forth. Now, I'm not a prophet, I can't say whether that's really so, but that is the way I look at it. Well, here's the job we've got on our hands. We in Britain, with the problem of our foreigners, West Indians and others coming in, you with the gigantic problem of the Negroes in the South, South Africa with this appalling problem of apartheid, the fears of the white minority, the rising passions of the black majority. We've got plenty of problems on our hands, but I don't believe any of them are insoluble. Now, supposing Karl Marx gets his way, man shall live by bread. Supposing we get to the point where everybody in the world has a house, owns it, everybody has food to eat, everybody has clothes, everybody has a job, life becomes easy, comfortable and contented. What happens next? Well, we already know the answer. In a society like that, people are going to be very bored. Life is going to become tedious and uninteresting because effort and strain have been taken away, and apparently human beings prosper when things are a little difficult and they have to put their backs into things and get things for themselves. We have quite a problem of juvenile delinquency, and so have you. What is the origin of juvenile delinquency? I would say 80% boredom. Again, when I was a boy, the English boy left school at 14, went straight into a job which would probably keep him on the run for 12 hours a day. He'd be on the job by 6 in the morning, come home 6 at night, dead tired. His mother would give him tea, Everything he earned, he'd put into his mother's lap to keep the house going, keep just $50 in his pocket for himself. He would sleep through the night and be up again on the job early the next morning. There just wasn't time for most of them to get into very much mischief. And now, longer schooling, shorter hours, better pay, leisure, and no idea of how to use the time. You wouldn't want to go and spend your summer evenings in a little hot, crowded tenement dwelling, perhaps just 2 or 2.5 rooms for the family. You'd be out on the street corners, no encouragement to read, not enough money to go frequently even to the movies, no appreciation of music or a concert. What do you do but stand on the street corners, meet your contemporaries, talk over plans of all too often gangs, raiding, violence, and the rest? Here is the symptom of what is going to befall the whole of the human race unless we take steps in time to educate ourselves for this new world. And you don't see it only among the delinquent teenagers, you see it among the delinquent adults too. Anything to get a kick. If it isn't one thing, it'll be another. If it isn't drink, it may be drugs, and not only among those who get caught by the police and sent to jail, but on quite high levels of society, there's this creeping greyness of boredom, dissatisfaction with life, not knowing where to turn, not knowing where to get any interest or excitement. Now this, I think, is where the Christian gospel comes in. What I've been saying so far, I believe to be profoundly Christian. It is the will of God that his children should be fed and clothed. All God's children got shoes, the old Negro spiritual. I believe that to be profoundly Christian, but now we've got to go deeper. What does the Christian gospel say to this new situation, which is beginning, is taking hold of us, and will spread as prosperity is extended and there's a better distribution of the wealth of the world among the nations? What is man? Nobody finds it easy to answer that question. I believe most of the definitions are wrong. You cannot define man as an individual. It's a hopeless task. You can only see man in his relationships. Man is a meeting point of tensions, and only if you see him in that way can you understand what we are and what our potentialities are. Now, the Christian view is that man is man only when he is related in 4 directions: down, in, out, and up. Only when he is related to the world beneath his feet, the world of non-human nature, inanimate and animate, including the animals, inwardly to himself, so that he can live as an integrated being, outwards to his kind, in amicable and easy relationships, and upwards to God, in whom the whole thing is gathered. As Indian culture on Hinduism, the culture of the Far East on Buddhism, and every religion has found its expression in a culture. Now, the great cleavage of our Western society is that those two things are falling apart when religion is separated from culture. When religious people are interested in religion and not in the whole of life, religion becomes anemic, bloodless, introverted, and ineffective. When culture gets separated from religion, it becomes demonic. The worship of man, the glorification of man, and you see the extreme form of it in a thing like Nazi Germany. These two have got to be held together. Now we see over a very large part of the world's surface a deliberate, purposeful, patient, persistent effort to exclude the divine dimension from the human consciousness. That is most obvious in the communist countries, where religion is the opium of the people. The anti-God campaign is perpetually active, constantly being renewed by stimulation from above, and for the first time, a great, intelligent, and gifted nation is trying to live the experiment in a purely three-dimensional world, a world of things you can see and touch and handle, with the transcendent entirely excluded. Do you think that's limited to the Marxist countries? Don't let yourself be fooled. In Britain, we have a very strong movement called scientific humanism, particularly strong in the University of Oxford, which recognizes that man cannot live without art and ideals and religion, but these are to be purely humanistic, purely immanent, developed from within man by man himself, and not dependent on any creator God, not on any revelation which reduces man to the status of a dependent child when man now is adult and can stand and ought to be able to work for himself. After all, if the spider can produce so beautiful a thing as a spider's web from its own entrails, why should man not produce his own religion, shoot his own ideals up onto the sky and adore and worship them? That is, I say, powerful in Britain. I think it will certainly spread here. It does correspond very closely to what I find in a great many universities and faculties. In my student days, the physical scientists were still the enemy, and we've got them tamed. They find so much mystery in their own field of science that they have to respect the kind of mystery which we as Christians believe in. The opposition comes much more from the schools of history, philosophy, especially psychology, sociology, and anthropology, which are presenting another gospel in which there is no transcendent dimension, everything interpreted in human terms, everything related to the conditions and limitations of human culture, again the attempt to live in a three-dimensional world in which there is no beyond. No beyond in time, in the sense of life after death or immortality, no beyond in society, beyond the mere human tensions and forces which work in the evolution of society. Now, the Christian contention is that if you leave out the linchpin, the whole thing will fall apart, the linchpin being God. What happens to man when he tries to live in this three-dimensional universe without the essential central factor? Everything falls into chaos, man becomes maladjusted in the other three relationships. First, in relation to nature. There's a marvelous phrase in the book of Genesis. I don't know how you read those early chapters of Genesis. Some people still try to take them literally. Some people regard them just as old Babylonian myths. If you read them with imagination, you'll find what tremendous phrases they contain, what power there is in them to give direction to our lives. There's this marvelous symbol that God planted a garden and put man in it to dress it and to keep it. Man is intended to be the gardener. This beautiful world is given him in trust to care for, to cooperate with God in creating and fostering the beauty of the world. A wild rose is a very lovely thing. I think we are all glad to have the cultivated roses too, with our marvelous range of colour and beauty. Well, God made the substratum, the wild rose, and man added to it. Through the gifts that God has given, he can produce new forms and types of beauty. Find a good old honest Scandinavian farmer. You don't have to look far in Minnesota. See how he regards his land, how he almost worships it, how his whole aim is to keep it in good heart, to leave it to his children in better shape than he found it. That's his vocation and that's his glory. But let man forget that relationship of being a servant to the world, and what happens? Man is the great maker of deserts. He becomes a savage in his world instead of a gardener. Years ago in North China, I flew over the Yellow River Valley. There, man in his improvidence cut down the forests for firewood, and looking down from the aeroplane, it was like flying over the surface of the moon. These loose hills, that loose, friable soil. Now the trees are cut down. Every time it rains, every drop of water makes a channel. In a heavy rainstorm, the rain makes gutters down the sides of those hills, carries away all the fertile topsoil, and then down in the valley that topsoil gets waterlogged and useless, so man has created a desert. Most of you, I expect, have read John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. That picture of the period of the Dust Bowl in the south, where Farmers came aiming not to care for the soil, but to get as much as they could out of it in just a few years and not put enough back, so that the topsoil was blown away by the tempests and the whole thing reduced to a desert. Same thing is happening in Africa today. All tropical soils are light. They have to be very carefully tended and fed and held together by fertilizer and vegetation, otherwise they too just blow away. And where God made the possibility of prosperity and beauty, man has made a desert. And why does our civilization specialize in the production of ugliness? What has gone wrong with our powers of construction? I have lived for years in Indian villages. In those Indian villages, nothing is ugly. It may be very, very poor, and yet because people have used the same materials through generations and centuries, they have mastered them. Even the little Indian hut, cottage, earth walls and thatch has proportion and style. The simple vessels made by the village potter have grace and dignity. How much have we lost through our mechanical civilization? Alas, poor London. Do you know it? London had a graceful, rather low skyline, very few buildings of more than 8 stories, a skyline broken by the great buildings, the church spires, the great constructions of Wren and other famous architects of 2 or 3 centuries ago. And now in London too, they're putting up these up-ended cigar boxes 200 or 300 feet high, without shape, plan, dignity or beauty, and our beautiful city has just been, I won't say ruined, that couldn't happen, but marred and scarred by the thoughtless incapacity of so many modern architects. Something has gone gravely wrong in our relationship. Then I said the second relationship is inward, that man should be able to live with himself at peace. And that is just what so many of the present generation cannot do. They're afraid of being alone, afraid of solitude because of the war within. Man is hag-ridden by his fears, his frustrations, and his resentments. That's why the psychiatrists have such a nice time of it. People will go and pay $15 an hour to a psychiatrist just to be able to talk, to unload all this stuff. They could, of course, go to the minister and get it all done free, but it seems to give them a certain gratification to be paying $15 an hour for getting this done. A sad, tragic situation. Of course, we are a bundle of contradictions. God has made us that way for his own purposes, and what we call original sin has come in and complicated it, and the delicate balance of our inner machinery has somehow got upset. So that instincts which in themselves are good become warring, dominating, tyrannical instincts. The instinct of self-defense is very deep in all of us. The instinct that if you hear glass breaking, immediately makes you put up your hands before your face to protect your eyes. That is good and a necessary part of the human makeup. But if this balance is disturbed, then that instinct of self-defense can so easily become suspicious, hostile, and aggressive. The sex instinct is one of the most wonderful gifts of God to men. How marvelously at this point of our being we are privileged to share in God's own creative work. What a fascinating field for study. And you think how akin we are to our beautiful brothers, the animals, and even down to the plants in this creative reproduction of ourselves. When Darwin first put forward his idea about the descent of man from the apes, people were very shocked and horrified at this kinship. Why should we be afraid of it if it is so? Look at the animals in their grace and splendor and beauty. Look at the birds in the mating season. The male decking himself out in all his finery, so solemn and just a little absurd as he tries to attract the attention of the female. The same is not unknown in human society. How delightful and charming and wonderful. And what have we made of it? dirty talk, anxiety, defiling this beautiful and glorious and wonderful gift of God, and so that gift, which was meant to be a most profitable and dutiful servant, servant to God, servant to the human race, servant to ourselves, becomes an angry master, and we just don't know how to live with him. Something has got gravely out of place. And then outwards in relation to other people. The other, instead of being the friend and the fulfillment, for so many people has become the enemy. I suppose you read Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist. I hope you do. A very remarkable writer, but how tragic. Sartre never seems to have been able to enter into human-friendly communication with other people at all, and so lives a life of complete isolation, anxiety, a threatened man. You remember the notable phrase at the end of the play, I know the French name, huis clos. No exit, isn't it, the English title? These three wretched people shut up in a room, tearing one another to pieces. At the end, one of them says, "Hell is other people." Well, if that's your view of life, you're not going to have a very contented and peaceful existence surrounded by the other. And in his novel, Nausea, Sartre describes how terrible it is to feel another man's gaze fixed on you, so that you become simply a person in his observation and his dream. That to him is terrible. But of course no man has a right to look at us in that way. But it is possible to look at the other as the possible friend, the ally, perhaps the one in need, and in any case the complement of human existence. Sartre seems never to have had the experience which always causes me so much pleasure when travelling in bus or train or plane. Some little amusing incident happens, you catch the eye of an entirely unknown person, both faces light up because both are enjoying, without malice, this little amusing incident. There is the correspondence through the eye. If we have seen something amusing, we like to share it and pass it on, the other the same. Here is the natural complementarity of human beings among themselves. And this, as I say, has so often been lost. We walk anxiously among men, the other man being the threat to our existence. We are restless, aggressive, hostile, and this translates itself onto the level of politics, where the nations find it no longer possible to dwell as a single family. And so it breaks out in hostility, tension, the threat of war, and even war itself. How can man be restored to his true being? Things are out of gear, unquestionably, in every society in the world. How can man be restored to his proper being? The Christian would answer, only by restoring the missing factor. The missing factor is the reality of God. Man is not a triangle. I hardly venture to say in the modern world, man is a square, but you know what I mean. There is this fourfold relationship. Without it, man is incomplete and imperfect. And only by getting back this upward relationship can man be saved. Now, this is where Jesus Christ is so supremely important, because once in history, you see a man live for 30 years as a son of God in the fullness of this fourfold relationship. I'm not today going to take in the other dimension of the divine aspect of the life of Jesus, which I profoundly believe, but simply to take the picture in the Gospels of a man who lives wholeheartedly, unconstrained and free in this fourfold relationship. He strides through the world as through his Father's house, with an eager, ready eye for those little simplicities and beauties, the scarlet anemones of Palestine, the lilies of the field, which alas I have never seen, never having visited that country. Perhaps one day I may. People who have seen them speak of the sudden glory. When the winter is past, the spring comes, and the whole hillside, almost overnight, stands there in its new glory. Is there any more beautiful poetry in the world than those words of Jesus? I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. The parables from nature, the seed growing secretly through the long months of winter, the time of growth and earing and harvest comes, the sparrow which falls from the nest, all these things he notes. Here is a man who is at peace in himself, the true man in whom all powers and faculties are drawn together into one single great harmonious purpose, and therefore there is dynamic strength. I have rather revolutionary tendencies. There are various buildings I would like to burn down, and there are a great many stained glass windows in churches I would like to knock out. We give our children a wholly false picture of Jesus Christ by this sentimental imagery. Remember that in the first chapters of St. Mark's Gospel, the words which come more often than any other are power and authority. The early Christians knew a thing or two that we don't. The earliest pictures of Jesus Christ are not representational. They show him as the young, stalwart shepherd boy carrying a lamb over his shoulders. That's the way a shepherd carries a lamb. In your stained glass windows, you'll see a tame elderly gentleman carrying a highly innocuous sheep in his arms, which is the way no shepherd will carry anything except a very tiny newborn lamb, as in the prophet Isaiah. And the Christians saw that elemental strength of Jesus Christ, and they represented it in this sturdy, young, beardless, stalwart shepherd boy carrying his sheep. They'd got it. Now, here, as I say, is a man in whom every power is knit with all the others in one harmonious scheme and one great purpose. Occasionally, men arise in human history with something of that same capacity, and usually, unfortunately, for destructive aims. You see it in an extraordinary fashion in Hitler, an evil man. One of Mr. Churchill's great flights of eloquence was just to refer to him as that bad man. What more could be said? But here was a man of immensely dynamic purpose, obviously considerable native gifts, without education, without upbringing, without social background, and yet an overwhelming dynamic purpose that recognized no limits, that swept away what we ordinarily call the censor, which holds us back from extreme action. One of the most interesting conversations I've ever had in my life was with a German diplomat, 1949. A group of four of us met on the banks of the Rhine. There was a young Dutch civil servant and a German journalist of aristocratic family, this diplomat and myself. He suddenly started talking. He said, of course, I knew Mussolini well. He was a much better man than Hitler. And he went on, of course, I knew Hitler well too. And he said, our great mistake was in underestimating that man. Lead me blindfold through 10 rooms, and I'll tell you at once which room the Führer is in. That electric power that sparked out from this man, and then his final comment was very interesting. He said, if you meet a man like that, there are only 3 things to do. Retire from politics and go and live on your estates in the country, sell yourself to him body and soul, or bump him off. Think that over and relate it to the Gospels. You find nobody could remain neutral in relation to Jesus Christ. You either sold yourself to him body and soul, or you bumped him off. Good Friday. There's the man who lives at peace with himself, and because he lives at peace with himself, he can live at peace with other men in this easy, unconstrained relationship of utterly devoted friendship to his friends, even when they are so obtuse, you want to knock their blocks off, they just can't understand what he's talking about, even when they are restless and ambitious, wondering who's going to get into the cabinet in the new kingdom, even when they are so weak that they run away, his friendship is absolutely unperturbed and unshaken, so easy and gentle with those who are out of the way, the publicans and sinners. People get puzzled about the miracles. A friend of mine who was a bishop in England once remarked, if only people would realize that the miracle of Zacchaeus is the great miracle, they would understand. Where Jesus comes into the house of the hardened, corrupt, oppressive tax-gatherer, says no single word about his sins, is just there the guest and the friend. The ice in the man's heart melts and he just becomes a new creature. Jesus, always on the top of the situation, unafraid of his enemies, frank, open, critical, sometimes harshly critical with them, always speaking the truth. He moves as a prince among men with the unconstrained give and take of a man who is not the least interested in himself and therefore free to be interested in everyone else. And all because at the center and at the heart is the great reality of God. The doctrine that Jesus was Son of God is not a metaphysical obscurity invented by the later church for the perplexity of the minds of the believers. It is simply an affirmation of what we see in the Gospels. The man who lives in this world in unbroken fellowship with God, and so is the real man. Now the question is whether we can discover manhood in the same way. That's why you come to a church college. So at the very heart of your education may be not God as a proposition or a hypothesis, but as the burning center of the world, in which all your different faculties, all your different pursuits, science, history, literature, art, mathematics, find their one unifying center, so that you may learn to be integrated men and women, able to live a human life in this world. What a wonderful thing that is when you see it. The best thing I know about the English people, being myself Irish, I view it with a certain detachment, is that every Englishman in his heart is a gardener. If you have the luck to get to England any time in May or June, and just drive through the country roads and lanes, you'll see the astonishing spectacle of the English cottage garden, perhaps just a little plot no bigger than this platform, but just glowing with brilliant flowers. Quite simple cottage garden flowers, lupins and delphiniums and nasturtiums, and of course a few roses. Admittedly, it's a bit easier there. The climate is more favourable to the growth of flowers than your highly stimulating climate in Minnesota. But even in the cities, even if the Englishman has nothing more than one single window, he wants to have a pot of geraniums, or he wants to have a window box so that he can have a little brightness, a little contact with nature. Now, as long as that lasts, people aren't going to be very, very far away from God. There's something that links them. That's the problem of our great concrete cities. So often one can go so far without seeing any trace of nature and any kind of beauty. How do you teach Sunday school, the parables of Jesus, to children who have never seen a cow except the contented cows in the advertisement for coronation milk? It isn't too easy. We've got a way, we've got to get back, and that has got to be in our hearts, that we are gardeners put in this world to tend it and to care for it, not to savage it and not to destroy it by the proliferation of our awful concrete ugliness. To live with yourself, not in self-hate and self-contempt, which does no good whatsoever, not an exaggerated idea of your own capacity just because you've been in college, a calm acceptance of what you are, a calm expectation that by grace tomorrow you will be something different from what you are today, with these rebel powers. Do you know where that phrase comes from? That great sonnet of Shakespeare, "Poor soul, thou centre of my sinful earth, fooled by these rebel powers at the array." If you don't know it, go straight and find it. I think it's 114, or one of the early hundreds, one of the greatest poems in the English language, ends with the magnificent, overpowering line, "And death once dead, there's no more dying then." If you don't know it, look it up. These rebel powers, this aggressiveness, this inner uncertainty and anxiety, this resentment against parents or society, this uncontrollable sex instinct that causes so much trouble, all these things fashioned into a beautiful harmony by the transcendence of God and his reality, and then this openness to others, be they what they may, male or female, old or young, educated, uneducated, white, Negro, Puerto Rican, Indian, whatever it may be, an openness which gives readily and joyfully and equally receives. We learn so much from those whom we sometimes regard as our inferiors, the milkman and the paper boy, and those who do us such ready and loyal service. This endless mutual giving and receiving, which is such a marvellous enrichment of the whole of human life. But these things cannot come about unless God is in his proper place. God not just as a phrase, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so we come back from our beginning in the temptation of Jesus Christ. It was a temptation to get God out of his proper place and Jesus out of his proper relationship. To you, with your hopes and expectations, your fears and anxieties, to ask, where do you stand? The man who lives in this fourfold reality, in this fourfold relatedness, is the real man or woman, the creative man or woman who has a gift to give to our troubled society and our troubled world. But remember that if you stand with your 2 feet firmly on the solid ground, if you reach upward to God who is above, if you stretch out your arms to embrace all men, your body automatically and inescapably takes on the form of the cross. Now that fourth dimension inwards remains a reality, but the man who so lives completely forgets himself, seeks nothing for himself. That is the life of the cross, and that is the redemptive life. In these next weeks we pass through Lent, we come to Good Friday with its shocking warning of what human nature can become, with its almost overwhelming tragedy. But the man on the cross says to us very gently, this is the only way to live. Come, follow me. And if we live through Good Friday with him, we come out on the other side into Easter, and we say, yes, that is the only way to live. That is the life that overcomes death and lives forevermore.